Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by the Current Consulting Group and sponsored by Gaze. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled The Changing Tide of Substance Abuse, Testing with an Eye Toward Impairment. Today's presentation qualifies for one continuing education credit from SHRM, HRCI, and CCDAP for those who attend the presentation in its entirety. You will receive information following today's webinar on how to apply for that credit. Today's webinar is sponsored by Gaze. If you're struggling with employees using cannabis in legal states or with employees using drugs like Delta-8 THC, fentanyl, and others, you need to know about this. Gaze uses highly accurate eye tracking technology to detect current impairment from virtually any class of drug. In just 6 minutes, you'll have a clear report indicating whether an employee is showing signs of impairment so you can make the right decision in the moment. For TPAs, you can use Gaze as a new service for your customers to help them identify current impairment rather than just prior drug use. Their solution is in use today by TPAs and businesses from less than 50 employees all the way to Fortune 500 companies. It's legal in 50 states and truly feels like the future of workplace safety. Now, I'm happy to present to you today's speakers. With us, we have Ken Fickler. He is the founder and CEO of Gaze, a first-of-its-kind real-time impairment detection platform. Gaze analyzes eye movement changes using artificial intelligence to discover impairment from cannabis and other drugs. Also joining us today is Bill Current, founder and president of the Current Consulting Group. He founded Current Consulting in 1998. He is a former VP of Consulting at Employee Information Services. He's also the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and a former director of the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace. He has also authored 10 books on substance abuse prevention and drug testing. And with that, let's turn it over to Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Greta, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I'm particularly excited today to be co-presenting with Ken. We've done some presentations before in the past, and I think you're going to find the discussion about the Gaze technology to be quite fascinating. Just as a little background, and on the screen right now is the agenda that we're going to follow today. But about 5 years ago at the Current Consulting Group, we work with, and we like to work with, companies that sort of represent emerging technologies or alternative screening methods, and we look for those companies that we think are on sort of the cutting edge of where the future of drug-free workplace and safety programs are headed. And about 5 years ago, we started looking, real seriously for sort of an impairment screening technology that could complement drug testing, or in some cases, in marijuana-friendly states, be an alternative that employers could use to sort of secure the safety of their workplaces. And as some of you may know, each year, and this goes back 26 years, so this year was our 26th annual drug testing industry survey. And about 5 years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years, it was in 2020 or 2021, we added to the survey a question about non-drug testing impairment screening. And we asked questions like, have you heard of it? Are you offering it? Is it something that your clients are interested in? And 5 years ago, the responses were really, really low, and maybe not surprising. But I think COVID sort of pushed all of us within the industry and those who rely on drug testing sort of down the path very quickly toward alternative testing and screening methods. So I'm going to share some results from our 26th annual drug testing industry survey a little bit later in today's presentation. I think you'll find it very interesting, but let's start with some current trends in drug testing laws and legislation, because these have a direct impact, these laws and the pending legislation that's out there now. And there's about 595 bills right now at the state level that are out there pending. Now, not a lot of them are going to get passed, and some have already been passed and enacted this year, but it tells you how active this issue is at the state level. A lot of them have to do with marijuana, and that's going to have a direct impact going forward on how employers drug test, but also how they screen employees for being fit for duty or possibly impaired on the job. So I think a couple of things right off the bat that are, very obvious. We're seeing far more positive drug test results today than we were 5 years ago, especially for marijuana. That's the number one illicit drug of abuse, no matter what the federal government does in terms of how it schedules it. There's some movement within the DEA to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which will complicate things a little bit for employers who are concerned about the impact that marijuana is having on safety in the workplace. But right now, we're seeing a lot more positive drug test results, especially for marijuana. And we're seeing states starting to pass laws that are making drug testing a little bit more challenging. They're not prohibiting drug testing. They can't do that. But they're making it a little bit more difficult for employers to do. New York, California, Washington, 3 examples. I'm going to talk about California and Washington in a minute. And then we're also seeing a movement toward alternative testing methods, especially rapid oral fluid testing, especially in California and Washington, where there's restrictions on testing for marijuana with urine, and then also proctored testing. And then, as you'll see in our survey results that I'm going to share in a minute, a significant increase in companies within the drug testing industry indicating that they're either offering impairment testing or they're interested in learning more. So I'll share more about that. I'm not going to go through all the stats on this page. I just wanted you to have them. You're going to get the link to the recording and you can go through this more slowly and look at this. I will tell you that if you go to like the third bullet down, between 2012 and 2022, so in that basically that 10-year period, we've seen post-accident marijuana positives increase by over 200%. And this is according to the Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index. Over 200% increase in not just marijuana positives, but marijuana positives from post-accident testing. In other words, you're gonna see more accidents in the workplace as the legalization of marijuana continues to spread. Look at that next bullet. 40% of people in one study said who work from home said that they have gotten high before or during work hours. And then there was a survey that came out this year of employed marijuana users who are employed, where they found that 48% admitted to using marijuana at work, either during a break or actually on duty, and 31% admitted that they use marijuana on their way to work. And sometimes in certain business settings, we as consumers might walk into a situation and the smell of marijuana is so obvious and prevalent, and you just know that person behind the counter or the person that's helping you with your whatever has been smoking dope. 60% of the people in that survey, that 2024 survey, 60% said they work for companies that don't do drug testing. So there's literally no barrier to using marijuana on the way to work, or maybe using it during your lunch break, etc., because the company doesn't even do drug testing. And 92% said that they work in a state that has legalized marijuana, either for recreational or medical use. So those are some pretty alarming statistics. And there's a lot of data out there right now on marijuana positivity rates going up. And there's a little bit more right here that kind of goes with the previous slide. I just want to talk about the second bullet. Marijuana positivity particularly surged in states with legal recreational marijuana laws, 118% between 2012 and 2020. So when we look at marijuana positivity rates, and we try to make, create a correlation between the legal status of marijuana in various states, you have to look at it both from the recreational marijuana perspective as well as the medical marijuana. There are a lot more states that have legalized medical marijuana use. I think we're up to, counting the District of Columbia, I think we're up to about half the states, 24, 25 states, counting DC, have now legalized recreational marijuana use. The interesting thing there, and something that complicates things for employers, is that all of these state laws are different. None of them are based on any single model or template. So you have to know what the law says in the states where you do business. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, we're in 25 states, which law applies to us? Which law should we be basing our drug-free workplace program on? And the answer is all of them. You can't comply with the Texas law for your business operations in Florida or Massachusetts, or a more sort of obvious one would be the the very liberal approach to drugs, marijuana in particular, and restrictive approach to drug testing in California, one of the most restrictive states when it comes to drug testing, and also one of the most lenient states when it comes to protecting marijuana users. You can't base your entire 50-state program on the California law when in Texas and Florida and many other states for that matter, where employers have many more rights to protect their workplace. And so you have to comply with all of them. But that bullet's particularly interesting because we've seen that surge in marijuana positivity rates, especially in states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana. Now, is it legal to test for marijuana? Is it permitted? As part of our industry survey, or excuse me, as part of our employer survey, we do a second survey every year, which this year will be in its 8th or 9th year. It's an employer drug testing practices survey where we survey employers themselves, and we'll ask the question, if you don't test for marijuana, why? And there'll always be 15 or almost 20% of the respondents who will say because it's not legal to test for marijuana in our state. That's not true in any state. There are some very restrictive states like New York, for example, where we just tend to tell employers you can't test for marijuana in New York. But if you read the Department of Labor regulations in the state of New York, you'll see that there's a loophole for reasonable suspicion situations and being able to test for marijuana. And of course, the DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations are not affected by any of these restrictions. You still must test for marijuana under the DOT regulations. And I think even after the Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 change that's in the works that will happen, might happen, probably will happen, I think I'm predicting there'll be sort of a safety carve out that will not affect the DOT regulations. In other words, you'll still be required to test for marijuana under the DOT regulations. That's just my prediction at this point. But when you're looking at these state marijuana laws and you're concerned about impairment in the workplace, you want to look for two different things in particular. A lot of these laws have some anti-discrimination language in them, meaning that employers cannot discriminate against legal users of marijuana. And that would take an entire webinar to go through that topic alone because they're different from state to state to state. But also look for language in those laws that gives you, the employer, the right to prohibit employees from being under the influence of marijuana while at work or bringing marijuana into the workplace. Now, we get a lot of questions about California and Washington. The bottom line is that you can still test for marijuana in California and Washington. You just can't test employees and applicants in California for marijuana with urine because it prohibits taking any action or discriminating against legal marijuana users based on a test result from a test that only reveals the presence of the quote unquote non-psychoactive metabolite of cannabis. In Washington, very similar language, but it only applies to pre-employment testing. But oral fluid testing reveals the presence of the parent drug, okay? It's not revealing a metabolite of marijuana, of cannabis, it's actually identifying the parent drug itself. And you'll see in the survey results I'm going to share in a minute that a lot of employers in those states, in order to maintain their drug testing programs, have switched to oral fluid testing. Whoops, one slide too many there. So, and this is a little bit about the California situation. Again, California applies these restrictions in AB 2188 apply to employee testing as well as pre-employment testing. So be aware that in California it's both, whereas in Washington it's just pre-employment testing. In other words, you can still test employees post-accident, reasonable suspicion, random, with urine and test them for marijuana and take action based on positive results. So the bottom line, as for my opinion, is keep testing for marijuana, but make sure that you're complying with those laws that apply to you. And inform your employees that even if marijuana is legal in that state, they still can't be at work under the influence of marijuana, that they may be subject to adverse employment action, possibly termination, if they're at work under the influence of marijuana. The third bullet down, very important, testing in safety-sensitive situations, workplaces, is typically permitted without restrictions, even in marijuana-friendly states. So you want a legally compliant drug testing program that gives you, the employer, or gives your clients, if you're in the drug testing business, the flexibility to continue testing for marijuana, to continue to take action, but you want to do it in compliance with those laws. Don't give up on drug testing. And in my opinion, keep testing for marijuana, but make sure that you're doing it in compliance with the laws that apply to you. There is an area of law, a doctrine of law, and I'm not an attorney, but I've got a couple of attorneys that work for us here at the Current Consulting Group, called, these doctrines are negligent hiring and respondeat superior. Respondeat superior, in particular, holds you, the employer, responsible for the actions of your employees when they are functioning within the scope of employment. So if you have a delivery van driver who is high on marijuana because you don't do anything to deter or prevent these individuals from being under the influence of marijuana while on the job, and he's driving that delivery van and he causes an accident and he hurts somebody or causes property damage, under the doctrine of respondeat superior, you, the employer, can be held responsible for the damages and the harm that that individual caused. If they're looking to sue somebody, they're not going to get much money from that delivery van driver, but they could possibly put your business out of business. That's the difference between a legally defensible program that complies with the laws and possibly being legally bankrupt. And I also want to point out that this is very important, that it's not just a marijuana problem. If you look at the data that comes out of the federal government every year in their national survey on drug use and health, you can see that we're seeing increases in other drug use categories. In particular, opioid-related overdoses increasing dramatically across the country. And there's some stats here just from Massachusetts, but fentanyl abuse is a real problem. And that was mentioned when we were talking a little bit about the gaze technology. THC, yes, but also fentanyl and possibly other drugs may be impacting the safety environment of your workplace. You want to make sure that you have a drug testing program that addresses all of these drugs, all of these commonly abused drugs. So if you're using the common DOT standard panel of drugs, you're looking at marijuana, cocaine, heroin, amphetamines, and PCP. But over and beyond that, there's that expanded panel under the DOT regulations, under SAMHSA Part 40. And you want to make sure that you're testing for those substances as well, because it's not just a marijuana problem. There are other drugs at play here as well. And this brings me sort of to my concluding thought in this first section, which is I think we're really shifting. There are legal and cultural trends that are starting to have a direct impact on what employers should be looking for. And so if you look at those last two bullets on the left there, I think we're moving away from the sort of traditional drug use detection type of program and moving more toward an impairment identification approach. And that's gonna, you're gonna hear a lot more about that as we talk about the gaze technology in a minute. I did promise that I would share some statistics from our 2024 survey. So just for your knowledge, if you're a buyer or a seller of drug testing, a lot of people in the industry say drug testing sales are up this year. Others, 19% said they're down, 38% said that they're up, and about 43% said that they're the same. That's not a negative or a positive, just holding steady, but a fairly healthy percentage, 38% saying that they're up, and a pretty healthy percentage, 47%, believe that drug testing is going to increase in the second half of the year. We asked some questions specifically about these new laws in California and Washington. And as you can see, there are some people in the drug testing world that are advising their companies not to test for marijuana in California and Washington. I think that's ill-advised if you're a provider, because you don't want to be the one telling someone not to test for marijuana when there are alternative testing methods that make it possible for employers to continue testing for marijuana. So 86% said, no, we don't give that advice, but 14% said they do. And I think I would rethink that approach if I were advising companies about drug testing in California, if I were one of those TPAs. Have you had clients discontinue testing for marijuana? 67% of providers in our survey said yes, they have. It doesn't mean 67% of their clients have stopped testing for marijuana, but 67% of respondents in our survey say yes, that they've had some clients drop marijuana from their drug test panel. And then we asked, have you had clients switch to or add oral fluid or breath drug testing? Now, breath is a relatively new technology. I wouldn't recommend it at this point because there's really, well, there's lab-based breath testing through labs like Quest Diagnostics. You can trust that, of course. But for an instant breath test for THC, you know, that technology is not ready yet. But look at over there on the left, 63% said yes, they've had clients in California and Washington add or switch to oral fluid testing because of these new restrictions on testing for marijuana with urine. Again, oral fluid reveals the presence of the parent drug, not the metabolite, which is what you get with urine and hair testing. You're detecting the non-psychoactive, as they like to call it in California and Washington, metabolite of cannabis, whereas with oral fluid, you're detecting the parent drug itself. Now, when we ask companies which drug testing methods do you currently offer, you know, this was very predictable, right? 93% said lab-based urine testing. That's been the foundation of the drug testing industry for nearly 35 years now. But a pretty healthy percent offer POCT urine, hair testing, and even lab-based oral fluid testing and POCT oral fluid testing. So we're seeing a lot more diversity in the testing methods that companies are offering. Because if you're in the drug testing business, what you want to be able to do is present solutions to specific needs that your clients have. Sometimes that one-size-fits-all approach is just not going to work. And as we talk about impairment screening a little bit later when Ken comes on, you're going to see that sometimes it may be a complement to a drug testing program with an impairment technology that is not necessarily collecting a urine or an oral fluid sample, neither one. Now, when we ask which drug testing methods do you anticipate offering in the future, I want to point out two in particular on the left there at around the 9 o'clock down to 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock on the dial there, which is rapid oral fluid and rapid urine testing. Seen a significant increase these days in companies opting to go with a rapid point of collection, instant result testing method, especially with oral fluid testing. So there was a great study that just, a report I'll call it, that just came out from First Advantage, one of the largest drug testing and employee screening providers in the world, really. And they came out with their annual trends report, and they showed a significant percentage increase among their clients who are using oral fluid testing. And then they said most of that was coming from rapid oral fluid testing. So they're seeing a very, very significant increase in oral fluid testing, period, and most of it coming from rapid oral fluid testing. And I think probably companies are very, intrigued by rapid oral fluid testing because the sample is easier to collect. You can do it any time of the day, any place. You don't need to secure restrooms. You don't even necessarily have to hire a professional technician to come in and oversee the collection. I like to call it, instead of a collector, you're really an observer when it comes to oral fluid testing, because you're observing the donor providing the sample. And because the donor and the observer / collector are right in front of each other the whole time, right? You don't need to secure a bathroom stall or anything like that. We don't have those privacy issues. Then they're right there in front of each other, and it virtually eliminates all drug test cheating methods that are so common with urine. You can't really swap samples. When you're sitting in front of the collector, you can't add anything to your oral fluid sample because that observer / collector is watching the whole process. And so I think that's having a direct impact on what employers are thinking in terms of, you know, how do I get the most out of my drug testing program? But in addition to that, it's sort of just the whole improvement on the return on investment from drug testing. Say, for example, you're doing some massive hiring. You're going to hire 100 people this week. And so you've got people coming into a job fair, or they're coming into a central location where you're interviewing hundreds of people for those 100 openings that you have. And if the ideal candidate is then sent to an offsite collection facility, they may never show up there to void a urine sample. When you take into account that their number one objective for the day is to get a job. And so while they're burning daylight, driving to a collection site, waiting 2 or 3 hours to be served there, they could be at another business or employment opportunity getting a job right on the spot, especially if that other job is where they do rapid results or instant oral fluid testing. And so the higher rate, the conversion rate of identifying the ideal candidate and then getting that person hired the same day increases significantly with rapid testing, whether it's rapid urine or rapid oral fluid. Oral fluid is just a little bit more convenient and user-friendly because we're not worried about bathroom stalls. So I wanted to point that out, that we're seeing an increase in rapid testing, both with urine and especially with oral fluid testing. We did ask this question. This is going to segue a little bit into the fourth segment. I'm going to do the third one in a minute, then I'll segue over to Ken's part. But we did ask the question, do you offer non-drug testing impairment screening? This issue comes up a lot, and it has historically. Does a drug test prove that somebody's impaired? A positive drug test result, is it legal or scientific proof, excuse me, that somebody is impaired? And the answer to that is no. We've never been able to make that claim in the drug testing industry. We've never been able to say that a positive drug test result proves that somebody's impaired. But with impairment screening technology, like what you're going to hear about with GAZE, it then becomes possible to make a direct link between somebody's aberrant, unsafe behavior in the workplace and some evidence or proof that they're impaired based on technology that's been in existence for a long time. I'll let Ken explain all of that. But in the survey, we asked the question, do you offer non-drug testing impairment screening? 14% said yes. And you're thinking to yourself, that's a pretty small percentage. But 5 years ago, when we asked this similar question, it was about 5%. So we've gone from about 5% to 14%. And that's not a scientific comparison, right? Because it's not the same people that were being surveyed 5 years ago as compared to this year. But we also gave them the option of marking no, but we're interested in learning more about it. And 25% said that. So when you add the two up, that's 39% of people in our survey said that they're either interested in learning more about non-drug testing impairment screening, or they're actually offering it. I don't know what exactly they're offering. We didn't ask that question. 61% said no, they're not. But I bet you if we ask this question again in our 2025 survey, we'll see even more movement, because I think it's a trend that as an industry, we need to keep an eye on. So as I kind of move my way over to Ken's part of the presentation, let me just talk about 5 things that really trip up employers when it comes to their drug-free workplace programs. And I'm going to call it a drug-free workplace program because it's not necessarily drug testing anymore, right? It could be impairment screening technology, could be other things in combination with that. But the number one mistake that employers make is they just don't keep their policy up to date. And so they've got a policy in place that their people are following in multiple states, and yet they've not updated it to comply with local laws in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. The problem with that is these laws are changing at a rapid pace every year. It's not to say that every year Iowa changes its drug testing law. That's not my point. My point is that if you're in multiple states, you very likely have changes to the laws that apply to you that may not be reflected in your policy, but should be. Because the number one name of the game is defensive. You want to be able to defensively support or defend your policy, legal defensibility. And so if you're not keeping your policy up to date, that's going to trip you up for sure. Consult with those state laws, and there's different kinds. I'll come back to this in a minute, and consult with the federal laws that may apply to you. When it comes to state laws, there are mandatory laws and there are voluntary laws. And I know voluntary law sounds like a oxymoron, but you have laws like here in Florida where I live, where it's voluntary for my company to participate in the program. But if we do, we have to drug test a certain way. But in exchange for that, we get a 5% discount on our workers' compensation premiums. And that's true in about 16 states. Other states like Iowa, like Minnesota, those are mandatory laws, meaning that any company that drug tests in those states are required to comply with those laws. You need to keep a close eye on case law, workers and unemployment compensation regulations, excuse me, which sometimes will allow employers to move to deny a benefit or a claim if they can show or prove that the individual had drugs in their system at the time of the accident. A drug test proves that. It doesn't necessarily prove impairment, but improves that the person had drugs in their system at the time of the accident. There are some states like Illinois and others that have industry-specific laws that only apply to employers in those industries. Be aware of that. And then, of course, the marijuana laws, many of which now contain workplace-related language, and you want to be up to date on all of that. The DOT regulations going through some massive changes now that they've put out regulations that are not fully in effect yet for lab-based oral fluid testing, but that should be coming probably in the next 12 months. Just a prediction on my part. Make sure you're training your supervisors and keeping them in the loop on everything that you're doing, because they're the people on the front lines that are responsible for keeping your program going. Don't expect them to be substance abuse experts. That's not their job. Teach them to identify aberrant behavior or unsafe behavior or performance in the workplace, and then under certain policy conditions, know when it should trigger a drug test. And then communicate your program to your employees. Let me spend a minute on a few bullets down towards the middle. Which drug you're testing for, very important. Identify how candidates' employees will be tested, what methodology, and when and under what circumstances the test may occur. And then towards the third one from the bottom, help them understand what the consequences of a positive drug test result or a refusal to be tested would be with your company. That's very important. And in your policy include, excuse me, a dedicated section for marijuana. I think that's critical. And then finally, 5, dropping marijuana from your drug test panel. I think that's a very big mistake in this day and age. Yes, legal in many states, but also the drug that is causing the most positives and where we're seeing a dramatic increase in post-accident positivity. A lot of information on this slide. Let me leave it at that. But these laws do not mean that you cannot test for marijuana. They do not mean that employees get to use marijuana at work or be under the influence of marijuana. So make that clear in your policy. A lot of stuff to unpack there. But I think that's a nice place to sort of segue to Ken's part of the presentation. So Ken, let me turn it over to you, and I'll advance the slides for you.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. That was great information, and I can't wait to see the full survey when that comes out. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how impairment detection technology and specifically GAZE works. So Bill, if you want to advance to the next slide. Perfect. So the platform that we've built is really intended to provide either front of line screening for impairment or confirmation of impairment if you have a positive drug test. It can be used in either case. Most of our customers today are using it as the front of line screening to look for impairment. And if they find that evidence of impairment, then they can transition into a traditional drug test to find out the substance that's causing that impairment. The platform that we've built, though, is really based on eye movement. And eye movement is something that has been used by law enforcement to detect non-alcohol DUI or driving under the impairment or driving under the influence cases for a really long time. There's something called the drug recognition expert process, and that is a 12-step process that's designed to elicit certain signs and symptoms of impairment that manifest. And a large chunk of those tests are eye movement. And what we've done is we've taken those exact same tests and we've automated them. So we've provided employers for the first time with access to well-known, trusted, and understood tests that have been used in court in all 50 states and are the subject of many pieces of scientific research. So the piece of hardware that actually conducts those tests is the VR headset that you see there on the right-hand side of the screen. That's a special VR headset. It's not just like an Oculus or something that your kids might have. It's got embedded eye tracking sensors, which are extremely high precision. We're capturing a very large amount of eye movement data. That includes both the direction in which the eyes are looking as well as the pupil size. And then we analyze that data that we get and look for signs of impairment that we know manifest as a result of drug use. And this all happens automatically. It all happens in the course of about 6 minutes. In the center of the screen, you see our mobile app. That allows our test administrators to start a test and then receive test results at the end. There's no interpretation that's required on the part of our customers. They have a very clear report of what has happened in the course of the test and any recommended next steps if there are any. And on the left-hand side, you see our web app that's appropriate for like an HR manager to oversee what tests are happening in a company, see what tests are happening at each location, and then download an impairment report, which is basically a printable report that can be included in a personnel file that basically just tells you what happened in the course of a test, as well as a bunch of metadata that we capture around the test. So one of the questions that we always get is, what substances is GAZE effective for? So what we know is that every category of substance has a unique way in which it impacts eye movement. And so what our algorithms do is they look for those indicators of impairment. So today we know we can detect impairment from illegal opioids like heroin and fentanyl, alcohol, prescription opioids, smoked and edible THC, as well as synthetic cannabinoids like Delta-8. For those of you in illegal states, Delta-8 is an absolutely massive problem. It's available at pretty much every corner gas station, and your employees are almost certainly using it if you're testing for Delta-9 THC. And then certain psychedelics like psilocybin, for example, we can detect, as well as stimulants. Stimulants include things like cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, some other substances like some synthetic stimulants that are a little less common, but really this encompasses the vast majority of anything you're going to encounter in a workplace. What I wanted to draw your eye to with these two charts here is an example of some of the data that we capture. And so on the left-hand side, you see it's a sober chart, and this is for a test called horizontal gaze nystagmus. And this is effective for alcohol and other depressant drugs. What we're doing is we're looking for the presence of nystagmus, which is an involuntary twitching of the eye that happens on the periphery. And so what you're looking at here is the peaks and valleys of this chart are when the eye is at the left periphery and the right periphery. And so in the left chart, you see relatively smooth peaks and valleys, and on the right chart, you see a very characteristic waveform that presents, and that's called nystagmus, and that's what our algorithms are detecting and then presenting a determination of impairment back to our customer. For every single test that we conduct, we're capturing over 120,000 data points, so this is extremely data rich. And we're analyzing this again completely automatically, so you don't need to do any interpretation or have any special expertise in order to utilize our product. Next slide. We really think that what we've built is the best fit for detecting non-alcohol impairment in the workplace today. It's extremely effective. We've conducted very large clinical trials to both capture data and build our algorithms, but also validate that these models are working. And so we've conducted the world's largest clinical trial on cannabis impairment. We've conducted a very large trial on alcohol impairment, and we are currently in process and have received approval for a trial that's going to be studying psychotropic drugs like benzodiazepines, certain prescription opioids, certain other prescription stimulants, things like that that can cause workplace impairment when used improperly, but are commonly missed by typical drug tests that would find, okay, this person may present with an opioid in their system, but they have a prescription. And so you need to know if that person is actually impaired on the job site or if they're just using their prescription as it was intended. This is really, really important and is an exciting next step, I think, for the company. Another couple of things. Sorry, can you go back, Bill, for 1 second? Thanks. So every test that we capture is backed by video evidence, and this is a really, really important piece of the defensibility of our product. This is a human interpretable video, so we don't do any alteration to it. We present it exactly as it was captured. And so a human expert witness in a worst case could analyze that video and say, yeah, here in the video, we see signs of impairment manifesting. And so that's an extremely important piece of certainty that our customers get and can have as if they ever need it in a court situation. All right, next step, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the use of GAZE as either pre-screen or post-screen for a positive drug test. So our test is looking for signs of impairment that manifest in the eyes. And what we do is we report on that impairment. We do not tell you if someone is, for example, if they're high on marijuana. We are not telling you that this person is high. We're saying we found signs of impairment. We think the next steps would be appropriate in terms of doing a cannabinoid panel. That's an example. We do this again for many different classes of drug. And this is a really, really important step, and in addition to a workplace safety program that has previously been completely missing and just sort of ignored, or you hope for the best, hope your employees aren't showing up to work impaired. What we're providing is certainty that someone is fit for duty, and that's an extremely important thing for safety-sensitive workplaces in particular. There are a bunch of different things that are typically taught in a reasonable suspicion class that supervisors can be on the lookout for, that would then cause them to think, hey, this person might be experiencing impairment. Maybe they need to go through a gaze test or be subject to a drug test. So things like nervousness, erratic behavior, things like that are going to be clear indications that someone might be experiencing impairment. You need to take a closer look at those things. And that could just be poor sleep or fatigue. But in the case of someone using something like Delta 8 or Kratom, you would never know if that someone, if someone is simply tired, slept very poorly the night before, is having some home stress, or if they're experiencing impairment from a drug without something like gaze that can help direct you into whether or not drug impairment is being found. Oral fluid tests, I think, are a really important wave that's happening in drug testing. And most of our customers today are using oral fluid tests as the confirmatory chemical test after a positive gaze test. So this is really, really important because it's looking for the psychoactive component of marijuana. It's able to really help an employer understand if someone used it recently, usually, typically within the last 24 hours or so, or if they used it, a long time ago. That's something that really has confounded traditional metabolite-based urine testing for a long time. Oral fluid testing for THC is really important as well because it's compliant with laws in California and Washington. So, we really encourage our customers to take a hard look at oral fluid testing if they're going to be adopting gaze, because we really think it's the best next step for a positive impairment result. All right.
So Ken, let me, if I could,
Please.
I know we're going to go into Q&A, but let me go back to a couple of slides from your right here. I wanted to point out that the fourth one over, smoked and edible THC. That's important. Not all emerging technologies are capable of detecting THC via edibles.
Yeah.
And so that's something you want to look at if, as an employer or provider, if you're considering a technology. Edibles are a big part of the marijuana movement and a big part of the problem. People who consume edibles with THC can test positive for marijuana, for THC, and they can be under the influence. They can be impaired. And so that's very important right there. And then I want to go back one more slide here. So Ken and I were at a conference, gosh, Ken, I guess it was in May that we were at the NDASA conference, right?
Yeah, I think so. Time flies.
And my booth, the current consulting group booth, was right across from the gaze booth. And just prior to the conference, I had come down with bronchitis, and I was taking a really strong antibiotic, and it really knocked bronchitis out. I mean, that was the good news. But it left me with sort of this lingering case of vertigo. And, of course, I look at the side effects of this particular antibiotic, and, dizziness was one of them. And so I was sort of dealing with that. And I went over to Ken's booth, and he had the device there out. And I said, well, let's test it on me, because there's definitely something wrong with my eye movement right now. If you're familiar with vertigo, especially benign positional vertigo, you know that in the throes of it, there's some really weird eye movements going on. So I don't want to tell you the results of my test or whether I was impaired at that particular moment. That's not the important part. I was able to get through the conference, but it was interesting because in this particular case, and Ken, you comment on this for me, but in this particular case, we weren't dealing with somebody who was necessarily impaired by drugs, but was certainly suffering from something that could have impaired my ability to do certain things in the workplace, like operate a forklift, etc.
Yeah, both great points, Bill. So on the edible side, yeah, I mean, there are some emerging technologies, in particular cannabis breath tests, that are not effective for edible THC. And there's not great data about which of the methods is used most often, but if you look at the sales data, I think California has done a great job of releasing sales data for cannabis. I think it's something around 50% of cannabis sales are for edibles. And so that's an extremely important trend that is completely missed by certain technologies. And we definitely detect impairment from edibles. Edibles are incredibly impairing, and the impairment can persist for much longer than for smoked cannabis. And the effects can be pretty, a little less predictable, I'll say, than for smoked cannabis. People can consume an edible and think it's not working and take more, or even an edible that was improperly dosed, or if they just are not an experienced cannabis user, they can end up to be very, very impaired, and edibles are very challenging for traditional drug testing. Onto your, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say on the edible side, I think the point you were getting at, I mean, there's no regulations on the THC level that can end up in some of these edible products, and if you're consuming THC via edibles, and as an employer you're not using a testing method that's capable of detecting THC via edibles, then you may have a problem and not even realize it. You know something's wrong, but you don't have a drug test to prove it.
Exactly, and the same thing is true of, I've mentioned Delta-8 THC a couple times here because I think it's a really big deal. People are using Delta-8 THC with virtual impunity because it's not going to show up on a traditional THC drug test. And so they can walk around your facility vaping a Delta-8 THC vape, and you'll be none the wiser. They'll be actively impaired, and there's not a whole lot, and there's essentially no chemical drug test that you're going to be doing that's going to be detecting that. Fentanyl is another one that most people think they're probably testing for. You're not. I can guarantee that unless you've specifically asked for a fentanyl drug test, you're not getting that. And obviously fentanyl is an incredibly impairing substance, incredibly addicting, and incredibly deadly. And so that's something that we have been having a lot of conversations about lately. Companies are getting very concerned with fentanyl, and we provide a way to determine if someone is experiencing impairment from fentanyl. So these are some emerging, I think, challenges that employers are dealing with, and something that we're hearing a lot about from the market currently.
Yeah, and then regarding the test that I took, I will say that it was a very comfortable process. It was not intrusive at all. It was comfortable. It didn't take very long, and I didn't feel like it was anything out of the ordinary to take the test with the headset on.
Yeah, thanks for that too. Relative to giving a bodily fluid, gaze is very well tolerated amongst employees. The one concern we often get is, oh, VR headsets make me dizzy. Well, we've turned off all the stuff that makes people dizzy typically in a VR headset. What's happening is people are looking around, and their inner ear is not correlated to what they're seeing, and so that creates the dizziness. And what our product is doing is basically just moving a little ball around on the screen, and so you're watching it like you watch a TV. And so none of the stuff that produces that VR sickness is present in our product, and we have never had someone that has come out of our product feeling dizzy.
Okay, so I think that's a good segue. I know we've got a lot of questions. I can see that in the chat section, etc. So Greta, why don't we go to some of our audience questions?
Sure, thanks, Bill. This one's for Ken. Is the testing specific for each category of drugs individually, or is it a general impairment determination for all categories of drugs combined?
The tests that we do not vary based on what we suspect someone could be impaired on. So you're going through the exact same process and producing the exact same video evidence and data and all that every single time. And what we're looking for are unique indicators that manifest as a result of each category of drug. Based on what we're finding, we can be very accurate at determining, hey, this person looks like they're on an opioid, or this person looks like they're on alcohol or cannabis, on and on. But there's no need to conduct different testing for any individual. It all sort of happens in the course of the same process.
Okay, thanks, Ken. This one is for you, Bill. The attendee said, I saw Minnesota is allowing oral fluid testing. Is it the same as California or Washington?
No, it's different. So Minnesota, let me start with California. California does not have a mandatory drug testing law. Much of the the legal governing of drug testing in the state of California is based on case law. Now we've got AB 2188, of course, which references, how an employer can test for marijuana if they want to take any kind of adverse employment action. So a little bit different there. But Minnesota has a mandatory drug testing law, like Iowa and several other states, where if you do drug testing in Minnesota, you must comply with this law. And in addition to that, they have a laboratory licensing law in Minnesota. And so for many years, many people assumed that under the laboratory licensing law, lab-based testing was the only testing method that was permitted in the state of Minnesota. I disagreed with that in the sense that if you were using a rapid oral fluid test that linked to a reader system, where the reader system was being analyzed by a laboratory or personnel in a laboratory, then that met the definition or the requirement in Minnesota. What they've now done in Minnesota is and this I think goes into effect here pretty soon, if not already, they've now specifically added language that makes testing with rapid oral fluid testing, a specific permitted testing method in the state of Minnesota. It doesn't refer to rapid urine testing, it refers specifically to rapid oral fluid testing, which is a very positive move and not one that you see a lot in other state laws. It's not like the restrictions that exist in California and Washington. This allows employers to continue testing for marijuana and to do so with rapid oral fluid testing. And it's sort of perhaps a harbinger of things to come, because I think you're going to see a lot more movement, sort of this middle ground between the pro-marijuana people who are afraid of drug testing and the employer communities like the chambers of commerce, et cetera, that want to protect employers' rights to have drug testing programs. And oral fluid testing, with its tighter window of detection, with its ability to detect recent use within minutes after somebody consumes drugs like marijuana, et cetera, and its ease of collecting, et cetera, I think you're just going to see a lot of states starting to pass laws like what we saw in Minnesota. It's just a prediction at this point on my part, but I think it's sort of a harbinger of things to come, where you're going to see more states amending existing state laws, drug testing laws, to specifically add language relative to rapid oral fluid testing. I think we'll see more of what Minnesota did.
One thing I'll note on Minnesota too is the state has the state's media has done a really bad job of explaining oral fluid testing in any sort of a scientifically defensible manner. They repeatedly have referred to oral fluid as an impairment test. That is absolutely false. There is no data that shows that oral fluid test for THC is any indicator of impairment. So just want to make that very clear.
Yeah, and going back to something I said early on, drug tests, in the industry, there may be some people who've done this, but generally as an industry, we've always been very careful to point out that a drug test result is not scientific or legal proof that somebody's impaired. For that, you need a technology more like GAZE, which is specifically impairment identification.
Thanks, Bill. This one's for Ken. How do you account for someone who has an eye condition, for example, a lazy eye?
Yeah, great question. So there's a bunch of different conditions that we are accounting for right now. Lazy eye is certainly one. That's called strabismus. And when someone has strabismus, it's typically corrected, but sometimes someone could have an uncorrected lazy eye. One of the things that we do in the course of our test is every test starts with an automated calibration process. And so what we're doing in that is making sure that their eyes are, that this person is appropriate to be going through the test and doesn't have something like unequal pupil size, which could be indicative of head injury. And we are looking at whether or not the person can track a stimulus equally with both eyes. For someone with a lazy eye that's uncorrected, that would not be the case. They could not track that stimulus with both eyes and would therefore not be able to go through our test. We need both eyes functioning properly, so no blindness, no prosthetic eyes, no uncorrected strabismus, in order to be able for us to go through the test and capture the data we need.
Thanks, Ken. Someone is wondering if your references recommendations of rapid oral fluid testing, if you're referring to POCTs.
Yeah, so the acronym POCT typically refers to either point of collection tests or point of care tests. And I hesitate to use that. I probably am one of the chief people responsible for people using that term because I used it for years. But point of care testing really sort of came out of a different type of medical care where, you were providing care to people, in a medical setting perhaps. And there are people that became confused by that. So I've more recently started using the term rapid result or rapid oral fluid testing in the case of oral fluid, or even instant result testing. But essentially what I'm referring to is a single use disposable test device, either oral fluid or urine, that yields an immediate yes or no result. It doesn't tell you what the nanogram per milliliter level was typically with a test like that, unless you're using maybe a reader system, a reader technology. But it would be yielding a result, within, let's say, 10 minutes of doing the test. And so that's what I'm referring to there.
Thanks, Bill. And I think we have time for one more. Given the ongoing shift from detecting active use versus off-duty use, I see some employers are still doing hair testing. Do you think hair testing still has a space, or is it something phasing out in the future?
Well, I'll take the first stab at it, Ken.
Sure.
I think there's a place in the world for hair testing. I think it's becoming a little bit more challenging. The legalization of marijuana has really sort of pushed us toward impairment identification. And so with hair testing, the drugs don't become detectable in a hair sample for 7 to 10 days thereabouts after the initial usage. But it stays identified in the hair follicle or the hair sample, I should say, for up to 90 days at the cutoff levels that we typically use. So you're not getting immediate use detection, and you're getting a really sort of long lifestyle view of that person's drug use behavior. And in the sort of world of legal marijuana, where employers are concerned about prying into the private lives and behavior of their employees, that longer view is maybe going to become less popular. I think you're going to see it in safety sensitive industries. I think the trucking industry loves hair testing in addition to the DOT compliance testing with urine. But I think you're going to see, I think you're going to see those niches continue to exist. Hair testing is a great technology, very accurate. There's a company out now that has a rapid hair processor. I mean, whoever thought that technology would come into existence? And so there's stuff like that out there right now. I think there's a place in the world for hair testing. But if you're looking for, if your priority is recent drug use detection, being able to detect drug use within, so let's say 10 minutes after somebody smokes a joint on their lunch break, then you want oral fluid testing. Even with urine, you've got that 6 to 7 hour lag time before the metabolite becomes detectable. And then the window of detection at the cutoff levels with urine is usually 3 to 4 days. Could be longer. It's the THC is detectable in the urine for a longer period of time, but at the cutoff levels, you're looking at about 3 to 4 days. Whereas with oral fluid, you can detect drugs within about 10 minutes after use because you're detecting the parent drug, like Ken was explaining. But the window of detection is much shorter. Typically for THC, it's going to be somewhere between 12 and 24 hours.
All good points, Bill. And what I would add, I think, is that if you're going to be peeking back in someone's life 4 to 6 months, like you do with a hair test, you better have a really good reason, or you're not going to have any employees. We are really commonly hearing that employees are increasingly intolerant of these tests that are looking way back into their life. And so, I think as Bill said, there's a place for it. Maybe nuclear, other things that are extremely safety sensitive, defense perhaps. But I would say the average company is probably not going to be a good fit for that.
Yeah, and I would say as sort of a conclusion to that, Greta, it's that, it's a combination of things. I mean, like Ken has told me many times, he's not advocating for the replacement of drug testing, but in combination with drug testing, the GAZE technology just gives employers a lot more information to make very important educated decisions that affect people's lives, that affect employment, and affect the safety of the workplace, et cetera. So it's a combination of things. Hair testing for one thing, oral fluid for another, the impairment technology like with gaze in combination. I like the idea, I think you mentioned it earlier, Ken, I like the idea of the gaze technology in combination with oral fluid testing, because I think that sort of meets, you know, a longer spectrum of the employer's needs to, you know, make sure that his employees are not impaired on the job, not bringing marijuana into the workplace, et cetera, not using marijuana during their lunch breaks, et cetera. And it becomes sort of a combination of technologies that gives employers all that they need to have the safest and healthiest possible work environments.
Wonderful. Well, we are past the hour, so let's wrap things up for today's presentation. On behalf of the current consulting group and GAZE, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. I want to thank Bill and Ken for speaking on this topic and sharing their expertise. And I also want to thank GAZE for sponsoring today's webinar. If you submitted a question that we didn't answer here today, we will answer you offline, and we will also send you information in a follow-up email on how to access the recorded version of today's presentation. In addition, we will also send you continuing education information for those of you that qualify to receive 1 credit for attending today's presentation in its entirety. Thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.